When we think of war, we think of the many battles in which soldiers have lost their lives fighting for their countries. When we think of World War II, we think of the rise of Hitler's Nazi regime and the bombing of the Japanese cities Nagasaki and Hiroshima. We think of the notable events, those which defined the war, typically the most shocking and sobering of the 6-year campaign. What we don't think of is the strategy, the mind games, the deception that went on behind the scenes. But that's exactly what we'll be focusing on today. Welcome and thank you for joining me. The story I have for you this evening is one of history. We'll be taking a look at what is quite possibly the greatest wartime deception and the man who saved countless lives after his death. This is the story of how British intelligence agencies created a fictitious Royal Marine, had him leak the details of their invasion plans and deceive Adolf Hitler, saving thousands of lives in the process. This is the remarkable story of Operation Mincemeat. Before Operation Mincemeat was even a concept in the mind of a British intelligence officer, the Trout Memo was released in September 1939. It was penned by Rear Admiral John Godfrey, Britain's Director of Naval Intelligence, and served as the inspiration for Operation Mincemeat. The Trout Memo is called such as it compared the deception of enemies during wartime to fly fishing, making the comparisons of waiting patiently to fall an enemy to taking the bait. There are 54 ways of deceiving the enemy listed in this memo, but the inspiration for Mincemeat was the 28th. The 28th item on the list suggested equipping a dead body with false papers and leaving it somewhere for the enemy to find. The idea of creating a fake persona for a dead body and leaving it for the enemy to find sounds like it came from a work of fiction, and in fact it did. The suggestion was inspired by a novel written by author Basil Thomson. The deliberate planting of false documents was not a new concept and had in fact been practiced during the First World War. However, some months before the planning for Mincemeat began, an important piece of information would be acquired. In September 1942, an aircraft flying from Britain to Gibraltar crashed off of Cadiz, a city port in Spain. It would later be determined that the Germans had gained access to documents carried by a French spy aboard that plane, proving that some information obtained by the Spanish was being passed along to the Germans. A month later, British intelligence officer Charles Cholmondeley would outline his plan, Trojan Horse. This plan would be the basis for Operation Mincemeat. Cholmondeley was a flight lieutenant in the Royal Air Force who had been seconded to MI5. He had been appointed as the secretary to an intelligence team in charge of double agents, known as the 20 Committee. In November 1942, the 20 Committee turned down Cholmondeley's plan, but seeing potential in it, they assigned Ewen Montagu to assist with developing the plan further. Montagu was a naval intelligence officer and naval representative of the committee. At this time in the war, there were only two viable options for the Allies to attack, the first being Sicily and the second being Greece and the Balkans. Should the Allies invade Sicily, they would open the Mediterranean Sea to shipping and allow invasion of continental Europe via Italy. Should they invade Greece and the Balkans, they would trap the German forces between the British and American troops and the Soviets. Adolf Hitler was particularly concerned about a Balkan invasion, a fear that the Allies were aware of and used to their advantage. The Allied forces launched Operation Barclay, an operation of deception with the aim of tricking the Germans into thinking that a Balkan invasion was imminent, when the real target was Sicily. The Allies went so far as to set up a headquarters in Cairo for a fictional formation, communicated movements for this false army, conduct military movements in Syria involving dummy tanks and vehicles to inflate numbers, and of course launch Operation Mincemeat as part of this campaign. Mincemeat would see a body floated to the coast of Spain carrying false documents with the intention of allowing that misinformation to be passed to the Germans, as it had done previously with the crash off of Cadiz. The wheels were turning and Hitler's fears were being weaponized. The most difficult parts of Operation Mincemeat would surely be those related to the body, whether that be the acquisition, the transportation, or the believability of the corpse upon discovery. Pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury informed Ewen Montagu that those who died in an air crash often died from shock rather than drowning. This meant that the lungs would not necessarily need to be filled with water. He also noted that Spaniards, as Roman Catholics, were averse to post-mortems and did not hold them unless the cause of death was of great importance. This information meant that mincemeat would likely have a greater chance at success than previously believed, and more corpses would be viable for selection. The next difficulty would be the acquisition, as there would be practical and legal difficulties in obtaining a body. Bentley Purchase, the coroner for the Northern District of London, promised to look out for a suitable body with no relatives looking to claim the corpse for burial. On January 28, 1943, Purchase contacted Montagu. He had located a suitable body. The body was that of Glyndwr Michael, a homeless man who had died from eating rat poison, a small enough amount that it would not be identified in the body later on. Purchase agreed to keep the body in the mortuary at a temperature of 4 degrees Celsius, preventing the body from freezing, as this would be obvious to the Spaniards upon discovering it. In these conditions, they had 3 months to execute Operation Mincemeat before the body would no longer be useful. On February 4th, 1943, Montagu and Cholmondeley presented their revised plan to the 20 Committee. The plan involved placing documents on the corpse and floated off the coast of Spain, whose government was known to cooperate with the German forces. The committee passed the plan, and Montagu and Cholmondeley were ordered to continue with their preparations. If this plan was going to succeed and not be dismissed by the Germans as misinformation, it had to be believable. The corpse could not just be found to conveniently be holding the plans to this Allied invasion. It had to appear to be real, a real person with a real backstory. A new name was given to Glyndwr Michael, Acting Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The rank provided to him would ensure he was high enough to be trusted with such important documents, but not so prominent that anybody would know who he is. In addition to this, William Martin was provided other details and documents expected of a real person. This is known as pocket litter. He was provided with a photograph of a fictitious fiancée named Pam. The actual woman in the photograph was MI5 clerk Jean Leslie. 2 love letters written by Pam, a receipt for a diamond engagement ring, a letter from his father, a note from the family solicitor, and a message from the bank demanding payment of an overdraft. These items all built up an image of who William Martin was, a young man recently engaged to his love who was awaiting his return, who had a family back home and unpaid debts with the bank. Alongside these personal letters and receipts were other everyday items, such as matches, cigarettes, and receipts from his stay in London, as well as an itinerary that could be constructed to cover his activities between April 18th and 24th. Glyndwr Michael's new identity as William Martin had well and truly been established, and anybody would be forgiven for believing this was his real identity. The last piece of the puzzle required were identifying documents for William Martin. Attempts to photograph the corpse proved unsuccessful, as they were clearly not photographs of a living person. Fortunately, Captain Ronnie Reed of MI5 was a close match to the cadaver and agreed to pose for the photographs in Royal Marine uniform. These were issued as replacement documents to avoid suspicion over how new they looked, and Montagu spent the next few weeks rubbing the cards against his trousers to provide some wear and tear to them. The fabrication of the documents also proved challenging, as several attempts were not able to produce a natural-sounding message. The author of the fictitious letter was Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, and after the failed attempts, he was tasked with writing the letter himself to make it more believable. It was a personal letter, something unofficial that would not normally be sent by diplomatic courier or encoded signal. Within this letter, a single black eyelash was placed within the interior of the envelope, a detail that would likely be missed by anybody tampering with it, but one that would sufficiently prove that the envelope had been opened. The letters were placed inside an official briefcase, ensuring that they would be discovered, and chained to the body's belt to keep it from drifting away in the tide. The body would be drifted outside the city of Huelva in southern Spain. Huelva was reportedly home to a very active German agent, Adolf Klaus, known to be efficient and effective. If the misinformation carried by William Martin was to make its way to Hitler, a man like Adolf Klaus would be essential. Also situated in Huelva was the British Vice-Consul Francis Hasselden, who was said to be a reliable and helpful man. In the early hours of April 17th, 1943, the corpse of Glyndwr Michael was dressed up as William Martin. The The pocket letter was placed on the body and the briefcase attached to his belt. The body was placed inside a specially developed canister. This canister was filled with 9.5 kilograms of dry ice and sealed shut. When the dry ice sublimated, it filled the canister with carbon dioxide, driving out any oxygen and preserving the body without the need for refrigeration. The canister was placed in the Fordson van of MI5 driver St. John Horsfall. Cholmondeley and Montagu travelled in the back of the van, which drove through the night to Greenock in West Scotland. Upon arrival, the canister was transferred to the submarine HMS Seraph. The crew aboard the Seraph were told that the canister contained a top-secret meteorological device which was being deployed near Spain. Only the officers on board knew the truth. 2 days later, on April 19th, the Seraph set sail. Despite being bombed twice during the journey to Huelva, they arrived safely on April 29th. They continued to monitor the coastline for a day, and at 4:15 AM on April 30th, the Seraph surfaced. The canister was brought up to the deck, and all the crew excluding the officers returned below. The body was lowered into the water, and the Seraph's commander, Lieutenant Bill Jewell, read Psalm 39. The wash produced by the screws of the submarine pushed the corpse towards the shore of Huelva. The canister was reloaded and later disposed of 12 miles away through use of plastic explosives. 5 hours later, at 9:30 AM on April 30th, 1943, the body of Major Martin was found by a local fisherman. It was taken to Huelva by Spanish soldiers and handed over to a naval judge. Francis Haselden was officially informed of the body and reported this back to the British. A series of pre-scripted diplomatic messages were communicated regarding the body of Major Martin, giving the appearance of legitimate communications for the enemies who were listening in on their messages. Knowing that the Germans would be intercepting these messages, they informed Haselden to retrieve the briefcase immediately, identifying it as an object of great importance. The following day, on May 1st, the autopsy of Major Martin took place. Haselden was present and suggested they finish up and have lunch due to the heat of that day and the smell. This action prevented the two Spanish doctors from realising that the body had actually been deceased for 3 months. The death certificate was signed off and the cause of death given as asphyxiation through immersion in the sea. The next day, Major Martin was buried in Huelva with full military honours. The Spanish Navy retained the briefcase and resisted pressure from Adolf Klaus and other German agents to hand it over. Had it been returned to the British without being opened, the plan would have been a failure. However, on May 5th, the briefcase was transported to naval headquarters at San Fernando near Cadiz. Whilst here, the contents were photographed by German sympathisers, but the letters were not opened. The briefcase then arrived in Madrid, where Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of the German intelligence agency, was able to persuade the Spanish to surrender the documents. The Spanish were able to extract the letters without breaking the wax seal and photographed each of them, passing this information on to the Germans a few days later. They carefully reinserted the letters into the envelopes so that they would appear to be unopened. However, they missed one crucial detail: the eyelash that had been planted with the letter. On May 11th, the briefcase and its contents were returned to Haselden, who then forwarded them on to London. Upon inspection, the documents were forensically examined and the missing eyelash noted. Further tests would show that the fibres in the paper had been damaged by folding multiple times, confirming that they had been extracted and read. The British sent another encoded message, knowing full well that it would be intercepted and read by the Germans. They told Haselden that they had received the briefcase and that the letters had not been opened. Haselden also leaked this information to known German sympathisers in Spain. A few days later, further confirmation of the successful deceit would come when a German communication was intercepted. That message stated that the invasion was to be in the Balkans. A message sent to Winston Churchill read, "Mincemeat swallowed, rod, line and sinker." Hitler went on to inform Mussolini, Italian dictator, that Greece, Sardinia and Corsica must be defended at all costs. He ordered the experienced 1st Panzer Division to be transferred from France to Salonika in Greece, an order that was intercepted by the British. By the end of June, the German troops on Sardinia had doubled to 10,000, with fighter aircraft as support. 2 Panzer Divisions were moved to the Balkans, torpedo boats were moved away from Sicily to the Greek islands, 7 divisions were transferred to Greece, and 10 were posted to the Balkans. Hitler had mobilized massive portions of his army. He was well and truly prepared to defend Greece and the Balkans from an Allied attack. On July 9th, the Allies invaded Sicily as planned, and despite this, German communications hours after the invasion began still showed their bolstering of Sardinia. Adolf Hitler was convinced that an attack on the Balkans was imminent and did not move on Sicily. Germany continued to defend the area despite no Allied attack coming. By the time the German command had realised their mistake, nothing could be done. July 25th, 1943, the battle for Sicily was going in favour of the Allies. The Italian Grand Council of Fascism voted to limit the power of Mussolini, handing control of the armed forces over to King Victor Emmanuel III. The following day, the king dismissed Mussolini as the Prime Minister and had him imprisoned. The new Italian government secretly began negotiations with the Allies, and Sicily later fell on August 17th, 1943. The German forces held off for long enough to allow many of them to escape back to Italian mainland. While Operation Mincemeat may very well be the most successful wartime deception, it is not the sole reason for the success of the invasion of Sicily. It's noted that Hitler seemed to have an obsession with the Balkans, refusing to believe that the Allied forces would invade anywhere else, and ultimately being preyed upon by his paranoia. His distrust of the Italians and unwillingness to risk German troops alongside the Italians also played a part in his downfall. Operation Mincemeat may not have been the sole reason behind the success, as you would expect it in fiction. However, it did save countless lives. The British expected 10,000 killed or wounded, but just 1/7 of that number became casualties. 300 ships were expected to be sunk, but only 12 were lost. What was expected to be a 90-day campaign in Sicily was over in just 38. It can't be denied that Operation Mincemeat was a resounding success. In years following, Ewen Montagu was appointed Officer of the Order of the British Empire in 1944 for the part he played in Mincemeat. Charles Cholmondeley was appointed a member of the Order later on in 1948. 2 years later, in 1950, Duff Cooper published a spy novel called Operation Heartbreak, the plot of which involved a corpse with false papers being floated off the coast of Spain to deceive the Germans. Duff Cooper was a former cabinet minister who had been briefed on the operation back in March 1943. The decision of the British security services was to publish the story of Operation Mincemeat in response to the novel's publication, and that is how we learned of the first details of this incredible wartime deception. Thank you for joining me for this story of history. If you have any comments, questions or suggestions, please feel free to leave them down in the comments section below. Until next time.